Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bridges Over Water, Part 1. I'm Hanobi Schoonover, Operations Specialist at Redmond Consulting, and I will be hosting this session. So, presenting this session today are Maria Limon and Victoria Ybanez. You can find their details down here. This project is supported by grant number 2017 TA AX K023, which is awarded by the Office of Violence Against Women, U.S. Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this publication, program, / exhibition are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the U.S. Department of Justice. This event does have captioning, which you'll need to manually turn on from the menu. If you have any questions or comments, you can put them into the chat box, or you can click the hand icon. You'll all be muted, so if we see the hand, we can then unmute you, so you can ask your question verbally. And I will now turn it over to our presenters.
Thank you, Hanobi. So I'd like to start by providing an opportunity for us to just tell a little bit about who we are, what our experience is, and I'll go ahead and start, and then Maria, I'll pass it to you. So I'm Victoria Ybanez. I'm the director of Redmond Consulting. I am Navajo and Hickory Apache and Mexican descent, and have been doing this work for 30 some years. And for me, one of the things when I think about this work, I'm grounded from an advocacy position. It's the core of the way I think about my work. And I started out as an advocate at providing legal advocacy, and then moved to working on shelter advocacy, on-call advocacy, and then transitional housing advocacy. And then moved into multiple other aspects of the work. And then about 22 years ago, I started doing National Tribal Technical Assistance, which is really an exciting opportunity for me to be working directly with our tribes and to be able to connect and see the amazing work that our tribes are doing. And in that work, I've worked across multiple different areas. And one aspect of that has been around coordinated community responses, multidisciplinary team responses, and sexual assault response team responses. And I think for me, when I think about that type of work, it's some of the strongest ways that we create change in our communities. Not to say that advocates don't, because I think advocates do amazing change work as well. But it's laid a lot of foundation for me, and it actually gives me a lot of questions for thought around to think about, how is this system working? How can we be better? How can we be more informed? And how can we communicate and cooperate with each other? I am located here in, I always say sunny Colorado, but it's not so sunny out today, but beautiful Colorado in Colorado Springs. I'm going to turn it over to Maria.
Buenas tardes, good afternoon, y'all. Maria del Socorro Limon Castro. I am thrilled to join you today. I was born and raised along the border with Mexico, and I am of Raramuri heritage, though I was unfortunately not raised within the culture. So I've spent the majority of my life figuring out what that disconnection did to me and did to my people and did to my family. So that is how I came about this work. My technical job is as a technical assistance provider, specifically for people building coordinated responses. I like to think of it as the best way to approach the ending of violence, because there is just no way that one program, one agency is going to be able to handle not only the seeking of justice, but trying to establish safety and provide for healing for people who have had to manage the effects of violence at the hands of somebody they love. So that's, you know, I say that my job is cheerleader, coach, and really loudmouth, I should say. And then the other part of my job is working with young people in high schools in Denver, and they are primarily Black and brown young people from different parts of the world. And they are looking to build a world that's free of all different kinds of violence. And they don't necessarily have what we would call a coordinated community response team, but they see themselves that way because they see that the only way to deal with this is to come together and as a community. And so that is where I come from. And in terms of the experience that I have, I was a first training coordinator for Love is Respect, the National Teen Dating Abuse Helpline. And I was also the training coordinator for the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And I heard a thing or two. I heard a thing or two on those lines. And then I started doing prevention work. I wanted to figure out how do we get to the root of this? And I already understood the connections between this violence and other forms of violence that our communities have been forced to endure. So I'm thrilled to be here, and I thank you all for making the time and for doing what you do, because it ain't easy. It is not easy. And here we are as a community going forth. So I really appreciate your participation today. Thank you.
And thank you, Maria. I'm really glad to be doing this work with you because you bring such enormous amounts of experience around working with children and bringing that coordinated response together. So I'm really grateful for that. Next slide, please. So just wanting to acknowledge that as we go through the different areas that we're going to discuss today, that the topics may not always be an easy one. There are trained advocates with us if you begin to feel uneasy or have some memories coming back that you need to talk about. There are people available for you to talk to. So feel free to reach out. You can reach out to the host and the host can connect you to one of the advocates also on the call. The host is Hanovi, just so that for you to remember that. Next slide, please. And just briefly, our vision at Redwind is to strengthen tribal programs and Native organizations' ability to develop and enhance local responses to domestic violence, sexual assault, teen dating violence, stalking, and trafficking. And with our Children and Youth Project, we hope to connect more student victims and survivors with tribal victim services and other programs that support them on their journey of healing. And while we have Redwind's slide, I just want to acknowledge, so we are the tribal government's comprehensive TA provider. Through that grant program, we have our Children and Youth Project, training and technical assistance through that project. And we also have our tribal college campus project, which works with all tribal college campuses across the United States. And we assist them with developing holistic responses to sexual assault. As well, we have our responses for urban natives, training and technical assistance project, which works off tribal lands to strengthen and enhance the response to urban natives. And then we have an elder abuse MDT, multidisciplinary team project, where we work with tribal programs, developing and strengthening their multidisciplinary team response to elder victims. Next slide, please. So a question to you, and as we're starting to move into having questions, just want to acknowledge that we really want to be interactive as a part of the time we have together. We want to be more conversational. So we're going to have different opportunities. We're going to pause for questions, for comments. And if in the process, if we haven't paused for one, please feel free to raise your hand. And we can pause and respond to that as well. You can verbally ask your question or share your comment, or you can also do that through the chat. So it's up to you, your choice. And we want to be responsive to that. And we want to hear your thoughts and comments as well. So we're going to start with a question about what is the vision of your organization? How are you keeping children and youth, victims and survivors in mind within your organization? So if you can either raise your hand or share any comment through the chat, we would really appreciate that.
Hey, Vicky, do you
Yes.
mind if they share their names as well? I would love to hear your names.
That'd be great.
Yes, and where you're from. I'm dying to know. Inquiring minds, we want to know.
Hello, Verlyn. And I'm just putting the question in the chat so that you can see that. And as people are talking about that, so I see Hope put in there, she's the project coordinator through Red Wind, located here in Colorado. So thanks for that, Hope. And I just want to share a piece of work from the work that I've done during the time that I was working in advocacy. So I had started off as a program coordinator for victims of domestic and sexual violence. And as a part of that particular program, we realized when it was being developed initially, we were planning just on working with the adults. And then all of a sudden they came with children. And, it's sad to acknowledge that it was like an afterthought, like, oh my gosh, there's all these children here. And I see that a lot through the TA that we do, is that as we reach out to programs and ask them about what they're doing with children, that oftentimes they say, oh, we don't work with children. And I remember one program we talked to said, no, we don't work with children. And they were operating a tribal shelter and said, oh, but now when I look at the data, we had 200 children come through our program last year. And so while they didn't have a direct program defined, they were actually providing program services to children. And that's what happened with us, was that all of a sudden there were children that were coming with victims, and we had to think through how are we going to respond to them and start figuring out how to make sure that the way we're engaging with children is going to make a difference in their lives. We have this window of opportunity with the adult victim, the non-offending parent, and at the same time, we have this window of opportunity to make a difference in the children's lives, because children are being directly impacted. And oftentimes, if our advocate programs aren't recognizing that there are children coming through our programs, we're missing that opportunity to strengthen their opportunities to heal from the violence that they have witnessed and directly been experiencing by virtue of being in the household and seeing what's happening in the household. I know as I've worked with adult victims, they've said, oh, they're asleep. They don't know what's going on. But then several years back, I was working on a community forum on children and youth issues with 2 tribes. And in that process, we developed a panel of adult children's victims, so young adults that had lived through violence over multiple years. And they talked about clearly how they heard, how they saw, how it impacted them, and how within advocacy programs that they felt like nobody saw them, that they were kind of invisible. So they didn't know where they could turn, who was going to support them, who was going to give context to what was happening in their lives.
You know, if I could pose an additional question, like my thought is, what is it that gets people invested in making this world better for youth? Like I'm just as an additional question to what the organizational's mission is. What gets you going? What revs up your engine? Because I would say that any coordinated community response is going to use that energy as a fuel to keep it going. So if anybody would like to answer that, that would be great. I think that my fuel comes from, I have a 16-year-old goddaughter who would have been the fourth generation of girls born into situations where there was sexual violence. And my friend adopted her at birth. And with the idea that the child would be kept safe. And she is 16 now. And not only has she been safe, she has learned about consent, and she has learned about how to establish those boundaries for herself. And so that just gave me even more fuel for us to keep going to do this work specifically for youth. Yeah, thank you.
That's a great question, Maria. I put it in the chat so that folks
Thank
can
you.
see it.
Yeah. Thanks. Okay.
I mean, if you want an answer, I would say, like, for me personally, I have children. So, but I started the work with kids before I had kids because I saw what was going on around me growing up, both in my own life and then also in the lives of friends, seeing them grow up in foster care, in youth correctional centers, wanting to make a difference and a change in my community to better make sure that I didn't have to see the next generation being taken from our communities and placed far away from home. Because sometimes the only really great thing about our communities is our friends and our community. Maybe life at home isn't the greatest, but we still have the support of our aunties and our uncles, and we have resiliency there in other ways, and we don't want to leave. And it's not always the best situation. So to be a part of an organization like Red Wind and to do the work in the communities is just my why. Like, that's my why, is to pass the information on to hopefully someone else gets it, like that we're kind of clicking a light bulb for someone, that they're like, yes, I want to make change. So, and yes, getting parents involved, that's so important. So thank you ladies both for being here today and sharing.
Thanks, Amber. And I do see Marcy in the chat says, we can't get parents to get involved in events that are for parents to learn from. So I'm hoping to change that.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things for me about creating that kind of change is, over the years that I've done this work, there's been that time, it's like you plan this whole big thing and you have one person show up, or, 4 people show up, or just a small handful. And one of the big things for me has been that I just keep going, because that's planting seeds in our community. Our communities have had so much violence, multi-generational violence, that historical violence that's taken place, that people often, there's this process of change that people have to go through, and healing as a part of it as well. And it just starts with one. As we heal this one person, this one individual, it has the impact of starting to heal that family and our community as well. So getting one parent to start working on it, then that parent starts planting seeds too, and it grows, which is a process of work and effort that we engage in. I also see that Hope says, being off reservation, it's important for me as a parent and advocate to bridge the gap between traditional and urban daily practices, making sure my children know who they are and recognizing the healing power and culture. The youth are our future.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Hope. And when I think about what makes for successful coordinated community response teams, there are teams that understand their core values. And I love how you expressed your value. That is your core value. And so, I could totally see how a coordinated community response team could reflect that core value, and it would make it that much more effective. So thank you for that. Yay, go team, look at us. Making a difference everywhere we go.
Well, and I also think about, so for myself, it was, caring about children. It was the act of having children that made a change for me. And then there was this other layer of change that happened for me in my work. And it happened to be when our children's advocate was gone she was out for medical leave for an extended period of time. Actually, she was having a baby and then caring for the baby afterwards. And so we kind of had this gap. And there was this young man, I say young man because that's how I remember him, but he was this child in our program at the time. And in his life, all of his adult role models were in prison. And his mother was a victim of all this violence. And the whole family had been struggling quite a bit. And this boy was, he was headed to become a gangbanger in the way he carried himself, the way he communicated, the way he interacted with people around him. He was just this tough, hardened child. And so our children and youth coordinator was gone, and I ended up responsible with providing transportation to children to go to this activity that was a really big deal during the summer. It was sailboating. And this was back in Duluth, Minnesota, where there was a bunch of water around. And so I had to pick up the kids at 7 o'clock in the morning to get them down to the sailboat in time so they could board and all leave. And so I had everybody meet me on the corner by our offices at like 15 minutes before we had to go. And this boy was the first one there. And there were other kids that were late, and he was like, Vicki, just leave them. They don't deserve this. And he was just like wanting me to leave them. And I'm making phone calls and trying to track people down. But during the course of giving him rides, we started building a little bit of a relationship. And he had a blast on this activity that they did that summer. And it lasted for a couple months. And as a result of how much fun he had in the activity, and I was the transportation, and he was always first. He was always first there waiting for me when I got there, that we started building a relationship. And there were times like he would be swearing outdoors, and I would say, no swearing allowed in the public spaces. And he would stop his swearing. Oh, I'm sorry, Miss Vicki, and he would apologize. And then he started helping, like, he'd see me arrive and he'd carry my bags. And what I started to realize that summer was what that little bit of engagement that I was doing made this huge difference in this boy's life, to where, fast forward a few years, because it was I had him, he was in my life for multiple years through our program, and then afterwards, because he was in the neighborhood and I would run into him at the grocery store. So here I am at the grocery store one early evening, like about 7 o'clock at Cub Food buying groceries. And all of a sudden I hear my name being screamed across the grocery store. And I'm looking and I find him. He's in a tuxedo with his girlfriend in a dress, and they're going to prom. I don't know what they were doing at the grocery store, but it was so important for me to see him, how dressed up he was, and how proud he was with the two of them as a couple. So we chatted for a few minutes and, oohed and awed over how great they looked, and sent them on their way. And then, a few more other contacts in between. And then one day I went to buy groceries and he was there working. And he's like, Miss Vicki, I graduated from high school. and I got a job and I'm saving up money and I'm going to get my own apartment. And this boy who I swore was going to have a path to prison because of all of his role models. And I know it wasn't just me by myself, but my relationship with him happened as a result of my interactions with him. But there were other factors that were playing out at the same time where people were paying attention to him, giving him the supports, praising him, holding him up in a way that his normal world, his common world was not doing. And it made all the difference in his life and gave him a different future. And that young man, and I still remember his name today, but because of confidentiality, I won't say that. That young man moved forward in his life because of what we offered through our program. The advocates we had in our program, the things we did in our program, and for me, the relationship that I built with him. And he forever changed me.
Yeah. Yeah. It's mutual. It is definitely mutual. Yeah. So Vicki, did you want to go to the next slide, or did you, I'm just wondering. 'Cause I would love to see the information, but I would rather see our faces highlighted if at all possible. We can show the slide and then we can cut back to us if that works.
Yeah, I would say let's skip two more slides to where
Okay.
it says everyone has ancestors.
Okay, yes.
Kenobi, can you do that? Awesome.
Perfect. Thank you.
And I love that about everyone has ancestors. It's that piece where we are not alone. We even at times in our darkest moments, we are not alone. And it's important for us. And I also, when I go back to what Hope was saying about teaching her children who they are, teaching them their traditions, their culture as an important part of the work that we do, that it's important for our Indigenous children to recognize who they are and who their ancestors are, where they come from, and the strength of all of what that means.
Yeah.
Anybody have any thoughts about ancestors? About your ancestors?
I guess for me, one of the things that I think about when talking about our ancestors and where we're at with today and where we're at with our kids is I want to, and this isn't my philosophy, because like, again, thank you ladies for all the work that you've done, because I a lot of times talk about the things that I've learned from Vicki and from people like Sandy and people like Maria out there doing the work, the foundational work, the stuff that they've carried forward from our ancestors and applied to the work that we do today. And that's where I have learned it from. And I'm grateful to have had those experiences where so many of us haven't. And so just being mindful that so many of us grow up not knowing our language, not having regalia made for us. My grandma did those things for me when I was little, and I'm so grateful. But I know that it stopped, you know, like for some of my other cousins and for different reasons, grandma passing on, and it just isn't continued the way that I would like to see it. And I hope that someday I can be a contributor to that part of the giving of our people. But for now, I try to give the knowledge that I've been grateful enough to have passed forward and bring it into today's work. So those of you at home kind of thinking about it, what your ancestors have passed forward, not just our historical trauma, but our historical resiliency, our strength, their guiding presence. My grandmother, without them, I wouldn't be here doing the work that I'm doing today. And at the same time, I recognize her struggle and not knowing her language and her not being able to go to sweat and ceremony legally until 1978. And I know that you guys know what that looks like in your lifetime, to not be able to do the things that we are afforded today. And yet our generation sometimes feels like, well, I don't belong there because I grew up over here, or I'm not enrolled, or those different types of barriers. But we are still Indigenous, and we are still just as much a part of our ancestors as they are a part of us. So I guess I just want to wrap up with that, but thank you guys.
I'm wondering what Berlin, if you don't mind me asking, what are you thinking? I know that you're keeping parents and engaging parents in mind. If you can, if you're available, maybe not. I think when I think about my heritage and I think about my ancestors, it's complicated, because in the act of being colonized and missionized in the Sierra Raramuri, a lot of what we learned was how to be oppressive. And so whenever I think about what I got from my ancestors, I consider the strength and real talk. I also consider how I learned to perpetuate violence and harm. Not my fault, but it's there. And I also learned resistance from them. I also learned how to do that. I just learned, and some of it is not healthy. I'm just going to be honest with you. One of the things that I found out, Vicki, guess what? For people who've been colonized or missionized or enslaved, we were made to do things we did not want to do. We did not want to do that. We did not want to leave our lands. We did not want to lose our heritage. We did not want to lose our culture, our teaching, the medicine. We didn't want to lose that. You know, for people who were kidnapped and brought, to this hemisphere, they didn't want to be here. They did not want to be here. And one of the residual effects of that is procrastination. And I see that getting handed down, it was kind of an act of resistance. Like, you want me to do that, but guess what? I'm going to put it off until the very end, but it also comes back and it haunts me, Vicki. So I love this conversation about ancestors and about the complications. And I love that part of my work and our work is to sort it out and being honest with each other, being really on with myself, with myself and with advocates. I love this kind of conversation for that reason, because it makes me more human. It makes me more human in the process. And I think that's ultimately what we want to see. People who are totally human and connected and to their stories and to their peoples. Yeah, so that was a good question. I didn't know that was going to come up. Oh, Lauren.
Lauren says, I still struggle all the time with my heritage and saying that I'm Native. It's almost second nature to push it down because I feel like not growing up in that culture, not knowing anything about it, that to find it this late in life and hear it's okay is so moving.
Yeah.
Well, and I think, that piece connects to me, like when we think about the histories of colonization and systems of oppression and the methods of oppression, that was the intent, was for us to lose our identities in the process. And, and so many people are affected in so many different ways. I was working with a person from a state coalition, a Native person from a state coalition who was asked Red Wind to work with some tribes and within that state. And one of the things that she said is that she struggles with the fact that she herself, because she ended up leaving the reservation at such an early age, that she has this disconnect from her own culture, from her own homelands. And yet also she sees that in the advocate programs as well. So that when we're talking about and striving to create something that is decolonized, that builds resilience and strength, you know, connects back to the strength of our ancestors and the resilience of our ancestors, as well as the teachings of our ancestors, that it's hard for programs to do that. And in one conversation she and I had, I was telling her this one exercise that I used to do in a training would talk about our cultural belief systems and work at, if we were creating a perfect world from our original beliefs, what would that look like? And it was one of the hardest exercises I've ever done. And I've done it repeatedly. And what made it so hard is because in between those original belief systems, we have this long stretch of history of oppression and harm and destruction that occurred, and particularly thinking about the boarding schools. So we have multiple generations raised by institutions that raised many of us. And as a result of that, trying to envision a world that carries those original belief systems, those values of strength and beauty and all of what that means, is really challenging. Of how do we do it different? How do we do it from this place? And where I think about how it's so important is that we know from many, many stories that we've been told, and now literature, you know, academic literature is starting to inform us that our cultural ways and our teachings are our most effective healing options. And so for us as advocates, we then are challenged to figure out how then do we incorporate that into what we do.
Yeah. Lauren, I think that for myself, I was raised so far away from the heritage, so distanced from it. Just in one generation, the connection was lost. From my grandmother to my mother, to me, it was poof, gone. And I would say that even for my grandmother, it was still very distant for her. And the thing that I'm learning for myself, to position myself as somewhat almost as an ally, because unfortunately, all of the racist messages about Native peoples that white people hear, I heard. And to grapple with that, while at the same time acknowledging that I come from this amazing people, that story is also part of my story. It's a very interesting way of approaching things. And I would say for so many of us, I think that's the beauty of thinking about these topics as we're building a coordinated community response team, because all of those realities exist in our communities in different ways. The questions that we're grappling with, people in our communities are grappling with. And I love that a team gets to acknowledge that and seek to heal some of those ruptures as a way to end the violence. I feel you're right. It is a direct path to healing. And I would say it is also a direct path to prevention. And it's a direct path to justice that we can take by basing our efforts on those teachings that are affirming and alive. They're still alive. Yeah, they're not lost. So thank you.
Do we want to go next slide?
Vicky, are you muted?
Oh, yeah. So I keep saying next slide, and sorry, thank you. Next slide, please, Hanovi. So I'm going to read this. Lakota is not my, Lakota teaching is not my way, but there's a lot in here that fits within the teachings of my own nation. In the Lakota society, it was the duty of every parent to give the knowledge they possessed to their child. Each parent was a teacher, and as a matter of fact, all elders were instructors of those younger than themselves. The instruction they gave was mostly through their actions. That is, they interpreted to us through their actions what we should try to do. We learned by watching and imitating examples placed before us. Slowly and naturally, the faculties of observation and memory became highly trained, and the Lakota child became educated in the manners and the customs of his people without a stained and conscious effort. And this is from Luther's Standing Bear, Ogallala Lakota, Standing of the Spotted Eagle, 1933. And I love this. And as I mentioned it, this is a Lakota teaching, and in the way I was taught, yes, there's all that teaching that happens within our families. And then we have this direct layer of the responsibility of our grandparents. And so the grandparents for us, as a part of ensuring the teachings continue forward, it's our grandmother's responsibility to teach their granddaughters, and it's the grandfather's responsibility to teach their grandsons. And then it carries forward. So it carries forward through 2 generations. As a part of, in my family, my grandmother, it was her responsibility to ensure that we received the multiple different teachings, and it was done through lots of different storytellings and how they learn their lessons to carry those teachings forward. And we heard those stories many times through the years growing up. And then as my grandmother would come to the end of her life, then we were all called together as granddaughters to hear her stories again before she passed, which to me has been really sacred as a part of the way I received it. And yet, as I'm hearing those stories sitting at her feet at the end of her life, remembering the stories that I was told before, but then hearing them this time about that, knowing I wasn't going to hear them again. So there was a different level of importance that I placed on it to make sure that I tried to imprint them into my brain so that I could tell them completely and accurately to my grandchildren. And I now have 2 granddaughters and have started telling the stories to them. So they'll hear them probably thousands of times before I call them to hear the final stories. And in that, as I have moved through my life, so it was in my 20s when I heard the stories from for the last time from my grandmother. And as I've moved through my life since then, I'll be doing something and I'll be like, this is what she meant, and it'll be like, aha, it's clicking in a different way for me. And it really lays a foundation for the future. And what that opens up for me is thinking about that intergenerational work, how that is so important. And the first shelter that I worked in, we had this program where it was some kind of a federal program. I can't remember exactly what it was called, but it was a way that we could bring elders in, and they received a wage and they got paid, and then we had to create a job for them. And in the shelter, the job that it was for that elder to come in and be a grandmother. And we offered ideas and suggestions, and it was up to the elder to decide what kind of energy that they had and what they wanted to do. And and some of the time it was just sitting and rocking babies and little children. And other times it was baking cookies or sitting and playing, Candyland at the table with kids after school. And it was just such a valuable connection. When the kids would come home from school, and they would call her grandma, and they would come in and is grandma here, and excited to spend that time with the grandmothers.
Young people know a good thing when they see it. Yeah. Gloria D, welcome. Good to see you. Vicky, I just have to comment on all these really fabulous pictures that people have. I want somebody to come and take mine so I look that good as well.
My video is not working.
Gloria, where are you from? Tell me.
I'm from Four Corners area from Farmington, New Mexico.
Okay, very nice, very nice. Thank you for joining us. We're having a nice conversation about values and teachings and how they are the best way to get establish a good footing for young people as we try and end violence.
Oh, okay.
So, you know what? So we did ask one question, and I'm wondering, Gloria, if you wouldn't mind answering it. But what motivated you to do this work? I mean, what gets your engine going as it relates to working with young people to end violence?
I put it back in the chat again.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Well, I currently am a project director to a couple of grants, and one of them is a drug-free communities grants for youth. And I have an extensive background in social work. I have my master's in social work. And
Oh,
I have been working with a diverse community in the area in Farmington, as well as, you know, we border the Great Navajo Nation. And so a lot of my work, my past work was working with the Chief Prosecutor's Office with the Navajo Nation. And I gained about 13 years experience with them. And before that, I worked 10 years as a support staff with the ICWA unit with Navajo Nation as well. And I decided to go back to graduate school and graduated and got my master's in social work and decided to do my internship and stumbling across Capacity Builders, who are a nonprofit organization located in the northwestern part of New Mexico in San Juan County. And so they found what my background was. And after I did a couple of weeks of an internship, they hired me. And so I graduated, and they've been very supportive. They realize that I carry a lot on my belt as far as working with families and with youth. And so, you know, it's been my passion to work with young people. You know, we did launch a anti-vaping campaign and one of the Fort Defiance agencies on Arizona on Navajo Nation. So it was very, you know, to the grassroots community people, it's really hard for them to understand the the tools that they use for vaping young children. And they didn't know that some of these things existed in like a writing pen. It may, you know, things to just, you know, to like a pen, maybe just little gadgets that they actually use to smoke in. And they were really shocked when we did our anti-vaping training, our prevention educators. And, you know, the sad thing is that my prevention educators didn't really understand talking the language. So I had to go in and explain that. And I'm very bilingual in Navajo, and, you know, in Navajo language, everything's really detailed. Got explained to where there's water enhanced and with some of the 8 chemicals. And so it was really interesting because they didn't know anything about vaping. So my interest is to get the prevention and awareness out to our tribal communities that we serve our young people. And so, and a lot of our youth are different compared to when I was growing up, where things were a big no, and now things are just like available for our youth. And I think it just takes the guidance of of positive parenting, and a lot of our parents are very young, they've had children at a very young age. And we noticed, some of the things that a lot of kids came up to us during our outreach activities saying that, oh, my mom never taught me this, my dad never said this. So, and then they're like, some of them said, like, oh, we've never had a puberty ceremony, why is it important, and why is it important to have clans? So there's a lot of things just out there. And so we got our prevention educators who are out there that are willing to, educate our youth, as far as early as the junior high. We got 12, 11-year-olds who are, having their puberty early at age 10. So we have to do our teen outreach programs out there to the communities. And I think that's where I find my passion, is working with our young people. Thank you.
Thanks, Gloria. And I think you really hit some great points there about the importance of teaching, and how sometimes it's not happening at home where historically that's where it used to happen for most of our families. And then it, through different kinds of means, it shifted, and those teachings weren't happening. And now we're finding our programs are one of the sources for it. And for me, as I think about it, it's like the way we can find, the multiple different ways we can find opportunities to offer these different teachings to our children and youth is part of how we're healing our communities. And so maybe the parents don't have it, and that's unfortunate, but yet there's still a way for them to get the information and have the experiences that they need. That's going to actually, transform our communities and our societies.
Vicky, I was thinking about the experience of colonization in Mexico, and how we still see the strains of that in general overall Mexican culture, which is just a very mixed culture anyway. But in central Mexico, where the colonizers, the Spaniards in particular, had the hardest time colonizing people, it was those communities where men and women had somewhat equal access to power. And still, in those communities, you can't have ceremony if there are not men and women present, right? And so what they did is that they killed the men who fought the hardest, and then they terrorized and enslaved the ones who were left, and they killed the older women, the keepers of the medical knowledge. They killed the storytellers. They killed the people who had that essential cultural and medical and scientific knowledge. And they left women and girls and young boys alive. And what the missionaries' job was to do in those settings was to whisper into their ears, you will serve, you will obey, you will be quiet, you will serve, you will obey, you'll be quiet, you will serve, you will obey, you will do as you're told. And just over subliminally as they slept, that was the missionaries' job in those communities. And it's interesting to see the legacy of that repeated throughout different aspects of our culture now. And I one of the things that I love about this conversation is that it's about opening up through the storytelling of the essential knowledge. It's about not being quiet. It's about not doing as we're told. It's about defying those forces that would have us negate or distance ourselves from our source, from our people, from our history, from our perspectives. So These comments made me think about that. Thank you. And it always makes me mad, by the way, when I remember that. I get so mad because guess what happens to young people who are taught to do as the adults require of them?
Mhm.
Right for abuse and silence. It teaches silence. So yeah. So that's why it makes me mad. I'm not mad right now, just in case you were wondering.
Thanks, Maria.
Thank you.
Next slide, please. Because the result of all of that has led to some of the conditions that are in our communities, in our society. So we can see that through multiple different statistics. Next slide. So violent crime rates in Indian country are more than 2.5 times the national rate. And some reservations see more than 20 times the national rate, according to the Department of Justice. They also state an average of 4.1 lifetime traumas have been reported, with the threat of injury and witnessing injury being most common form of trauma exposure. And with these alarming rates, it's important to understand that it's likely that children exposed to violence at home are experiencing trauma and may suffer from long-term and short-term effects of trauma. Next slide, please. So as we look at that, the U.S. Attorney General's Defending Childhood Initiative defines children's exposure to violence as being the witness or direct victim of bullying, child abuse, sexual assault, community and child violence, and school violence, dating violence, and exposure to adult parental domestic violence. And I just really want to say one thing. So through some of the work that I did, we actually, through some coordinated community response work, we were reviewing police reports. And as a part of that, we had a certain question we were looking for about how these reports were, enhancing safety and holding offenders accountable. And with that, the documentation of what's being captured in there. And we were looking at reports over the span of 1.5 years in this one particular community or jurisdiction. And one of the things that we saw across all of those police reports was that for the most part, nobody was talking about what was happening to the children. And in particular, one report where violence was taking place in the cab of a pickup truck. So the victim was being assaulted in this pickup truck, and this 7 or 8-year-old child was in the cab at that time. So think of the confined space. And the only documentation in the report was that this child defecated. And when you think about that, about the intense fear this child was experiencing for them to lose control of their bowels that way. But yet nothing in the report talked about what did this child need, what was going on for this child, what was going to be the follow-up for this child. And so all of these different police reports we saw consistently, nobody was thinking about the well-being of the child. And we can see that in multiple other places. Just as I started out earlier on talking about within our advocacy programs, oftentimes we're not even thinking about what are we doing to look at what's been the impact on this child, and how can we work to undo some of the harmful effects, mitigate the effects of it, as well as strengthen resiliency and build the connection that child needs to recover from that abuse, because it is abuse for a child to witness that, to experience that. So we talk about child witnessing, and it almost seems like we're sitting watching a TV show, that we're so distanced and removed. So we see it, and we may have some feelings about it, but it's not the intensity of that child sitting in the cab of that pickup truck that was terrified. And we would really want to think about what that witnessing experience really is for that child, because it really is about they're fully experiencing the violence. Maybe no hand was ever laid on them, but there was still full experience of that violence.
Vicki, that made me mad too. Because you know what? The ways that we are able to distance ourselves from the violence, it's a direct connection to the legacy of the colonization. The violence that was committed against our people has been so normalized, the erasure, the dismissiveness, the ways that our humanity is consistently called into question, I think contributes to that feeling, as you said, of being able to look at things almost as if it were a movie and be distant. I think it's one of the ways people keep themselves emotionally safe, sadly.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right, and it never gets dealt with.
No.
So then that trauma that wasn't dealt with gets layered later with another trauma and with another trauma, you know, and that at some point we don't know what's going on in our lives and we're struggling. You know, we're struggling, like the example of that boy that I described earlier. That boy struggled immensely, and really fully didn't understand where that was coming from, and the parent didn't either. And so for us as advocates and those of us that are working with children in the work that we do, that we have this opportunity to make a difference for them. And it's critical that we have this window, that we use it as effectively as possible, as intentionally. And the intentional part in there for me is a critical piece, that it's not just happenstance, it's intentional. And one of the things I talked about in that forum, working with adult children of violence who had lived through it with their non-offending parents, that one of the things they said was, it felt like nobody saw us. And that we do that over and over and over again in our programs, in our schools, in where the places are supposed to be safe and supported, and really help wrapping this child and nurturing this child. Oftentimes they're not being seen for what fully is going on in their lives. They're being seen on the surface. And then as we look on this slide, it talks about some of the outcomes, so as we look at it, that exposure to trauma, that it has this outcome of increased risk for poor health, poor educational outcomes as a result of exposure to trauma. And so we're creating a foundation of losing our children, really is what's happening. Losing our children to alcohol and drugs, our children, laying a foundation that they'll stay in poverty for the rest of their lives, different kinds of things like that, that by not addressing the trauma and the structural violence, the discrimination, and all that intersection of violence that plays out, generation after generation, we're losing our children.
But it stops now.
That's right, Maria. It is stopping
It
now.
stops now. Enough. That's it. We've had it with that.
Right. So I'll provide a few more statistics. Next slide, please. So when we look at the statistics, 40% of US teens ages 14 to 17 have been exposed to at least one form of intimate partner violence during their lifetimes. 40% of 14 to 17-year-olds. That is huge. So we're starting to move toward nearly half. And with that, we know we have significantly higher rates within our Indigenous communities. So we're probably at least at 50% in there. 17.9% of children of all ages have been exposed to physical, intimate partner violence in their lifetime, or about 13.6 million children. 60% of children in a nationally represented survey had experienced at least one direct or witnessed violence victimization in the previous year. So here we go. We're over half, 60% of children, at least one direct or witnessed violent victimization in the previous year. So thinking about that child sitting in the cab of that pickup truck, 60% of children have different experiences, have had experiences in some level similar to that one child. 14% of about 10 million children experience some form of maltreatment from a parent or caregiver in the past year. And what we know with the impact of violence on children, so they're living in a home where violence is being perpetrated, and we know that a batterer or an offender who's perpetrating the violence has a higher likelihood of offending and perpetrating violence on that child directly. So going from the witnessing to actually experiencing that violence. Sibling assaults accounted for 29% of physical assaults experienced by children in the past year, although these declined with age and were surpassed by non-sibling peer assaults for teenagers between 14 and 17. And approximately 30% of children report moderate or frequent involvement in bullying in some capacity. Children involved in bullying in any capacity report higher rates of victimization in the home and community than their peers. So children witnessing violence are, we talked about where our teachings come from. They're learning it through observation, through experiencing it in their household. And this is the way they communicate, they, express their needs is through violence, because that's been what's been modeled to them. 9.5% of all children ages 0 to 17 and 11.4% of girls reported some sexual victimization in their lifetimes. Rates were considerably higher for girls, 14 to 17%, 34.9% of whom had experienced a sexual victimization over their lifetime. And I would argue that this is significantly higher for our Native children. Next slide, please. Consequences for health, education, and community connection. So basically what we're saying is that, the consequence left unaddressed, exposure to violence has, creates serious harm for children's ability to succeed in school, lead healthy lives, and contribute positively to their communities. Next slide. Youth ages. Next slide, please. Youth ages 10 to 17 who had engaged in delinquent behavior in the past year reported higher rates of exposure to violence than their peers who reported little or no delinquent behavior. Youth have been exposed to violence are at higher risk to engage in criminal behavior as adolescents. The landmark Adverse Childhood Experiences, also known as ACEs study, launched in '95, found a significant relationship between childhood experiences of abuse and violence and a host of negative adult physical and mental health outcomes, including heart disease, stroke, depression, suicide attempts, sexually transmitted diseases, and substance abuse. And then this slide, next slide, please. Children exposed to violence and trauma exhibit significantly higher levels of emotional and behavioral problems than their non-exposed peers. Witnessing or experienced violence has been linked to lower grade averages, more negative remarks in their cumulative records, and more reported absences from school than other students. So long-term effects of structural violence associated with racism and discrimination can cause cardiovascular disease, diabetes, depression, and chronic fatigue. And according to a national survey done in 2013, conducted about 7% of students had missed at least one day of school in the previous month because they felt unsafe at school or on their way to or from school. That was a lot. So we know there's so much harm that's been done as a result of this violence. And when we see all of that data, what we can extrapolate from there is, one is we know that it's going to be higher for our indigenous communities as populations, and that as a result of all this violence, without something to counter it, we're going to see some negative outcomes that are going to be lasting. So when we think about lasting impacts, with heart disease and, diabetes, poor outcomes in school, all of that kind of stuff, the more we experience traumas, the repetition of traumas imprints on our DNA. And as we think about our response to that, and just to quote Maria, and I know Maria needed to leave, one of the things that she talks about is slow down at the speed of humanity. When we think about a coordinated community response and where we're heading toward that, is that we want to think about how if we're going to have a coordinated response to children and youth, that we need to recognize that the mechanisms of adultism are not going to fit. And so when we think about that, what are the mechanisms of adultism, is one of them is rushing, that we're on the clock, we've got to get there, this has got to be done now. It's, we're in a rush from one thing to the next thing to the next thing. And so we need to be slowing down to find out what works for them, what works for children, what works for youth, and to be able to fully hear them. And I've referred back to a forum that I worked on with a couple tribes. And in that work that we were doing was we were literally trying to hear from children. One is to raise the awareness within the tribe about the need to be responding to children that have been impacted by domestic violence. But with that, what do the children say about what they need? And so when we reached out to young adults that had lived with violence to hear from them, that was one way to hear from them. And there's multiple other ways to hear from children. So, and I go back to that child in the pickup truck, that his physical reaction was a message to us. Basically that child was telling us a very clear message that those responders at the time were completely missing. And it's important for us to be thinking about those kinds of things. So we're going to see it within our advocacy program or within our shelter as we come into contact with children. We're going to see different messages from them. We're going to see the message from the child who is angry and throwing blocks or tearing up pages and yelling and screaming and having what we call tantrums, and saying, oh, they're just a little out of control, they've gone through too many changes, and not really putting it in context to see what's causing that. And then we're going to see the child who is quiet and withdrawn and doesn't want to talk and doesn't want to look, maybe clingy to their mother, or maybe just detached from everything around them, or maybe just zoning out on TV. That's escapism. Being shut down, closing off, you're escaping reality to some degree. And that's another message from a child. And there's a whole spectrum of different messages that children teach us and tell us. But for us in our adultism, we're busy rushing, and we haven't created the space within our programs to slow down and to hear what the children are saying to us. So as we look at that, we really, as we are moving toward talking about coordinated community response, so we're laying foundation through this conversation today and tomorrow. We're going to get into nuts and bolts. So what we need to be thinking about is, what are children telling us? And how are we hearing what the children say, whether it's they're directly saying it out loud or they're showing it us through their actions. You know, we need to be paying attention to hear that, to guide what we need to be doing. Next slide, please. So as we look at what's going on with children and how they're impacted, we can see multiple behaviors: moodiness, sleep changes in their sleep patterns, frequent nightmares, becoming aggressive with or withdrawn, being startled easily, developmental delays, alcohol and drug use. One personal disclosure, my first consumption of alcohol was when I was 8 years old. And myself and 3 other kids, we were eating a cherry pie and drinking gin. And I didn't continue drinking in that way, but it was what we saw our adults do. They were drinking and enjoying what appeared to be enjoying. And so we tried it as kids, and we actually, between the 4 of us, we probably could have done a lot of harm to ourselves with the amount of alcohol we consumed that day. And then the question goes to me, where were the parents and how did we have access to a quart of gin like that? And when you look at all of these different kinds of behaviors, oftentimes people will find ways to dismiss it. You know, that we can, you know, I mentioned being aggressive or withdrawn, you know, that being shut down, you know, oh, she's always been shy, or, you know, he's always had a temper. And for myself, as somebody who had lived with violence, and in the early years after I left that relationship, my son, who was less than 2 years old when I got divorced, was aggressive. He was an out of control child. And part of it, which I had to figure out, you know, it was hard for me to figure out what was going on with him because he didn't have the verbal skills to go with it. And in retrospect, I started to realize that this child was modeling, you know, the other parent's behavior, and had to figure out ways to support him and nurture him and to care for him in ways to make sense of what was going on for him. Next slide, please. So that brings us to thinking about, so why do we even need a coordinated community response? So when we think about a coordinated community response, we're basically talking about key people, key players, so to speak, coming together to help make a difference on what we're trying to focus on. So when we think about it in terms of working within children and within school and advocacy programs, and that we're coordinating a trauma-informed community response in their school, or within our advocacy programs to domestic violence, sexual assault, teen dating violence, sex trafficking, and other trauma-related issues facing our youth. We're coordinating within and amongst their programs to respond to children and youth that reduce the re-traumatization and re-victimization. And I want to leap back to some of our earlier conversation about our culture, our teachings, our customs, our beliefs, that's going to be some of the key pieces of how do we bring that in as a component of that, or as a, you know, center that in the way that we're doing that work, to be able to build the resilience, build something counter to the impacts of the violence that those children and youth have experienced. And we're also going to be improving access to victim services on and off the reservation, and on and off tribal lands. We're going to improve the relationship between the students, the teachers, staff, administrators, advocates, counselors, the, you know, health centers, and local programs. So a coordinated community response will also formalize policies and protocols of the coordinated community response to strengthen them and attend or create and provide training to better understand a trauma-informed approach to advocacy in the schools. So when we talk about that as a coordinated community response, one of the things that I want to offer to you, when we think about coordinated and we think about pre-colonization and the way our tribes, our tribal communities operated, we had a coordinated community response. That's a very indigenous concept. It was part of our survival. It was part of our protection of each other. It was part of the way we ensured the survival and sustainability of our people. So as a coordinated effort, we worked together to make sure we were fed, we were protected, our children and our elders were well cared for and supported and nurtured. Teachings were carried forward, and we all worked together. And it was as a coordinated effort, recognizing that everyone involved, no one had more value than another, that we together all had an important role. Next slide, please. So together, individually, we can support children and youth, and we can individually, while we're talking about a coordinated effort, takes the individual leadership, the individual effort to make that happen. And oftentimes our advocates have led the work in our tribal communities to make the difference. When I look back over the history of my work, it's the advocates who have said, hey, we need some kind of supports for victims, and we need shelter, and and that was all focused on domestic violence. And then it was advocates who said, we need to be responding to sexual assault, and carried that through each of those different crimes that we work on as advocates. It kept coming back and saying, hey, we need this, we need that. It was advocates who led the cry for the Violence Against Women Act, as well as the section Safety for Indian Women within VAWA. And so when we think about that in terms of looking at the needs of our children, it's going to be our individuals who are going to lead that within our communities, who are going to be able to say that we need to be creating a means to bring messages to our children, bring teachings to our children, and work within the school systems to provide responses and education to those that are working in the school system. Many of us as advocates, a lot of the data that I talked about, many of us as advocates, we're familiar with that data. We're familiar with the harms that children are affected with or affected by, but the school teachers aren't. They see some of it they don't understand, some of it they do, some of it they question, they know something's going on. The school administrators know some stuff is going on and oftentimes don't have full information to be able to fully do their work. And that goes with the school guidance counselor or the school nurse and a school security, all of the different people working within that school system. We really need to have a common understanding that's going to lay foundation for us to move forward. Next slide, please. So, and then we always have to talk about self-care. This is hard stuff. I told that story about that boy in that pickup truck, and that's a hard story for people to hear. And when you're doing that work deep in the trenches, you're hearing stories about children and from children. It's going to break your heart and can in effect break your spirit. And so self-care is going to be an important part of it. And with that, we need to be able to make it part of our regular routine. And we're modeling it. We're modeling it so that not only are we doing the care for ourselves, we're modeling it and creating that environment for children. So going back to you know, the way we act with adultism and that rush, got to get through it, we're on the clock kind of thing. We want to make sure that we, as we're working with children, we are slowing down and working at the pace of children. And I with my grandchildren, there's times they're telling me a story and I need to make sure that I have the time to stay present, because I'll get the story in pieces while they show me other stuff. And we need to make sure we're working with children in ways that we're meeting them where they're at, and that we are in a place to be able to hear it, to receive it, to engage with it. Next slide, please. And so it's the teachings. We want to make sure our children connect to their traditions, their teachings. And with that, that's going to be something that is, it's the way we teach that, we're going to build that sense of pride. So when we think about working with children who have been impacted by this violence, one of the things that we can do with children is to help them feel a sense of strength inside of them, something where they can see the beauty of who they are. And by helping them to fully see who they are as Indigenous people, as Indigenous beings, is going to be one of the strongest ways we can work with children. I used to work at American Indian Community Housing Organization years ago, and we were working on domestic violence and sexual violence issues. And we had an emergency shelter, a transitional housing program, and a legal project. And we engaged in a project that worked with children over the course of a year, that changed with the seasons and provided different teachings. And we created that because of the way the children were acting in the community around us. And by the end of 1 year of doing that project, the children were transformed. For life, I don't know. We continued to do the project for multiple years, but we centered teachings within it. And with that, it made a huge difference for people. So we want to make sure we're thinking about how we can do that within our own tribal identities. So as you're working within your tribe, what are the customs, what are the practices, what are the teachings that can be offered within there? And so tomorrow we're going to spend time talking about, we're going to take what we talked about today and we're going to move into the nuts and bolts of the coordinated community response, and talking a little bit more about what a CCR is, and what are some of the steps in pulling one together within a school system. I want to thank you all for joining us today, and looking forward to connecting with you tomorrow. I hope you can all come back. And if you've got, when we start off tomorrow, we're going to spend a little bit of time kind of revisiting where we were today. So if you've got any thoughts that you want to share tomorrow, definitely, come prepared to share those. We'd love to hear some of your comments and your experiences and your thoughts about the work that we've been talking about. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Vicki. All right, following this session, there will be an evaluation. We would appreciate any feedback you'd like to share with us. So if you could fill that out, we'd very much appreciate it. All training materials will be accessible via Dropbox once all the sessions are over, or if requested, can be emailed to you. Thank you all again for joining us, and we hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.